What would you do if you discovered someone was systematically targeting vulnerable elderly women in your neighborhood? Would you call the police? Would you warn your neighbors? Or would you do what I did? Become the perfect bait, let them come to you, and teach them a lesson they'd never forget. Well, when that doorbell rang at 9:30 p.m., my 6-month plan was about to be tested. My name is Betty White, and at 98 years old, most people see exactly what I want them to see. A fragile, lonely widow living in a house too big for one person. They see the slightly trembling hands, the confusion about modern technology, the way I seem to struggle with my purse at the grocery store. What they don't see is the woman who spent 35 years working undercover operations for the FBI, who can spot a con artist from 3 blocks away, and who has been systematically documenting every predator who's tried to take advantage of elderly women in Golden Valley, California. It started 6 months ago when my neighbor Margaret Hendricks called me in tears. "Betty," she whispered into the phone, her voice shaking like autumn leaves. "I think I made a terrible mistake." Margaret was 82, sharp as a tack, and had lived in our neighborhood longer than anyone. If someone could fool her, they could fool anyone. The man had appeared at her door on a Tuesday evening, clipboard in hand, wearing a pressed blue shirt, and that practiced smile I'd learned to recognize decades ago. He said he represented a local charity, helping seniors with home repairs. Margaret's porch steps had been wobbly for months, and when this helpful young man offered to fix them for just the cost of materials, she thought it was a blessing. He was so polite, Betty, Margaret told me, her words catching in her throat. He called me ma'am, and helped me with my groceries. He said I reminded him of his grandmother. That's when I knew we were dealing with a professional. The grandmother line. It's textbook manipulation, designed to create instant emotional connection and trust. But here's what really caught my attention. This wasn't his first visit to our neighborhood. Mrs. Chen from Maple Street had mentioned a similar young man, offering computer help for seniors. Mrs. Rodriguez on Oak Avenue had talked about someone wanting to help organize her finances. Different services, same pattern, same smile. Someone was working our neighborhood systematically, and that someone had no idea they were about to meet their match. That night, after Margaret's call, I sat in my kitchen with a cup of tea and made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't going to be another victim's friend, mourning their losses and shaking my head at how cruel the world had become. I was going to be the hunter. I pulled out my old case files. Yes, I kept them, every single one from my FBI days, and started building what I called Operation Lonesome. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Become the perfect target. Let them come to me, document everything, and then show them what happens when you underestimate Betty White. First, I needed to establish my cover story. I started shopping at different times, making sure to seem confused about prices, fumbling with my wallet, mentioning loudly how I just didn't understand all these new payment methods. I canceled my newspaper subscription and started having groceries delivered, making sure the delivery drivers heard me talking about how lonely the house felt since Harold died. But here's what made me perfect bait. I actually was a widow, I actually did live alone, and I actually did have significant assets. The difference was, unlike Margaret and the others, I knew exactly what I was doing. Every confused moment, every vulnerable gesture, every accidental mention of my financial situation was calculated to draw in exactly the kind of predator who had been circling our neighborhood like vultures. I set up security cameras disguised as garden decorations, installed recording equipment that looked like old radio equipment, and prepared my house like a stage set. In the living room, I left bank statements casually visible on the coffee table, real statements, but from an account I'd set up specifically for this operation, with just enough money to look tempting. I scattered photos of Harold and me around the house, making sure our wedding rings were visible in every shot. I even bought a large dog food bowl and left it by the back door, then made sure to mention to neighbors that poor Rusty had died recently, leaving me all alone with no protection. The fishing line was cast. Now I just had to wait for someone to bite. 3 weeks into Operation Lonesome, I got my first bite. It came in the form of a phone call on a Thursday afternoon. I was in my kitchen, organizing the evidence I'd been collecting, when the phone rang. "Hello, Mrs. White?" The voice was smooth, practiced, with just enough warmth to seem genuine. "My name is David Patterson, and I'm calling from the Senior Care Network. We're reaching out to widows in your area who might need some assistance with daily tasks. Senior Care Network. I'd never heard of them, which meant one of two things. They were new, or they didn't exist. I made my voice sound slightly confused, a little tired. Oh, hello, dear. Senior Care? I'm not sure I understand. Mrs. White, we understand that living alone can be challenging, especially with handling finances and home maintenance. We're a local organization that helps seniors like yourself navigate these complex issues. Would it be possible for one of our representatives to visit you? We offer free consultation. There it was. The hook. Free consultation, home visit, and that specific mention of finances. This was exactly the pattern Margaret had described. But instead of hanging up or saying no, I took a deep breath and slipped into character. Oh, that sounds wonderful, I said, adding a slight tremor to my voice. I have been struggling with some of Harold's paperwork since he passed. And the house does need some repairs. I let my voice trail off, sounding overwhelmed. I'm so sorry for your loss, Mrs. White. Harold sounds like he was a wonderful man. When did you lose him, if you don't mind me asking? Perfect. He was gathering intelligence, building a profile, almost 2 years ago, I replied. Heart attack. It was so sudden, and he handled all our finances. I'm afraid I'm quite lost when it comes to these things. Mrs. White, you don't have to handle this alone. That's exactly why we're here. Would tomorrow evening work for a visit? Around 7 p.m. I know it's getting toward dinner time, but our representative David, yes, we have the same name. Funny coincidence. He's available then, and he's particularly good with helping widows sort through complex financial situations. Evening visit. Check. Financial focus. Check. Using his own name to create false familiarity. Check. This man was hitting every red flag in the Predator playbook, and he had no idea he was talking to someone who had literally written training manuals on these exact techniques. 7 o'clock would be fine, I said. Should I prepare anything? Harold left quite a few papers. Don't worry about preparing anything, Mrs. White. David will help you organize everything when he arrives. Just have a cup of tea ready, and he'll take care of the rest. Oh, and Mrs. White? Don't mention this visit to your neighbors or family just yet. We find that too many opinions can complicate the process. It's better to get a clear picture first, then involve others. Isolation. The final piece of the puzzle. He wanted me alone, cut off from potential help or witnesses. Oh, I understand. Completely, I replied. Harold always said too many cooks spoil the broth. Harold sounds like a wise man. We'll see you tomorrow evening, Mrs. White. And remember, there's no pressure. We're just there to help. After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen for a long moment, feeling the familiar mixture of anger and anticipation that used to fill me before a big case broke open. This David Patterson had just made the mistake of a lifetime. He thought he was about to visit a confused, vulnerable widow. Instead, he was walking into the most carefully planned sting operation Golden Valley had seen in decades. That night, I prepared my house like a theater set. I moved the fake bank statements to more prominent positions, made sure the photos of Harold and me were well lit and visible, and set up my recording equipment. I called my old partner Jake Morrison. Yes, he was still alive at 89 and still sharp as a razor, and filled him in on the plan. Betty, you magnificent devil, he laughed over the phone. You're going to give this kid the fright of his life. Want backup? Not yet, Jake. I need to see how deep this goes first. But keep your phone on tomorrow, Noi. If this is bigger than one guy working alone, I might need the cavalry. The next evening, I dressed carefully in a flowered dress that was slightly too big, making me look smaller and more frail. I applied my makeup to emphasize the lines around my eyes, and made sure my hair looked like I'd styled it myself with shaking hands. The performance had to be perfect from the moment he saw me. At exactly 7 p.m., the doorbell rang. Through my security cameras, I could see him, mid-30s, average height, wearing khakis and a polo shirt that screamed trustworthy suburban professional. He carried a leather portfolio and had practiced that warm, sympathetic smile in a mirror. What he didn't know was that I had been studying predators like him since before he was born. I opened the door slowly, making sure to seem slightly unsteady. Oh, hello, dear. You must be David? Yes, ma'am. David from Senior Care Network. Thank you so much for meeting with me, Mrs. White. May I come in? And with those words, he stepped into my web. Please, come in. Come in, I said, stepping back from the door with a slight shuffle. I'm afraid the house is a bit of a mess. Since Harold died, I just can't seem to keep up with everything. David stepped into my living room, and I watched his eyes do exactly what I expected, a quick, professional scan of the space. He was cataloging everything, the visible bank statements on the coffee table, the family photos showing Harold and me in better times, the slightly cluttered surfaces that suggested an elderly person struggling to maintain order. What he didn't notice were the nearly invisible cameras recording every moment, or the fact that every piece of evidence he was seeing had been carefully planted. Mrs. White, first let me say how sorry I am for your loss, he said, settling into the chair I gestured toward. Harold must have been a wonderful man. Oh, he was, I replied, letting my voice catch just slightly. 45 years of marriage. He handled everything, the bills, the investments, all those complicated papers. I'm afraid I was never much good with numbers. David leaned forward with practiced sympathy. Mrs. White, you'd be amazed how common that is. Many women of your generation left financial matters to their husbands. There's no shame in needing help to understand what Harold left behind. Here came the first probe. I watched as his eyes drifted toward the bank statements on my coffee table. Positioned exactly where someone sitting in his chair couldn't help but notice them. The top statement showed a balance of not enough to be unbelievable, but more than enough to make him interested. I brought some tea, I said, standing up slowly and making my way to the kitchen. Harold always said everything looks better over a cup of tea. That's very kind of you, Mrs. White. While I was in the kitchen, I could hear him moving slightly in his chair through the hidden camera feed that displayed on my kitchen tablet. I watched him lean forward to get a better look at those bank statements. He was taking photos with his phone. Perfect. When I returned with the tea, I made sure to seem a little out of breath from the short walk. I'm sorry, dear. These old legs aren't what they used to be. Please don't apologize, Mrs. White. You're doing wonderfully. He accepted the tea with a warm smile. Now, I understand you've been having some challenges with Harold's paperwork. I sat down heavily in my chair and gestured vaguely toward a stack of folders on a side table. Folders I'd carefully prepared with a mixture of real and fabricated documents. It's all so overwhelming. Harold had investments, insurance policies, bank accounts. I don't even know where to begin. David's eyes lit up. Just for a split second, but I caught it. Mrs. White, that's exactly the kind of situation where Senior Care Network can help. We specialize in helping widows understand their financial picture and make sure everything is properly organized. That sounds wonderful, I said, then paused as if something was troubling me. But I have asked, this service, it must be expensive. I'm not sure I can afford. Mrs. White, please don't worry about that. David interrupted smoothly. Our initial consultation and organization service is completely free. We believe seniors shouldn't have to pay just to understand their own finances. Free service. Of course it was. Because he wasn't planning to charge me for his help. He was planning to help himself to what I had. But I played my role perfectly, letting relief wash over my face. Oh, that's such a blessing. Harold always worried about me being taken advantage of. He said there were people out there who would try to cheat an old woman. David's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. Harold was absolutely right, Mrs. White. Unfortunately, there are unscrupulous people who target seniors. That's why it's so important to work with legitimate organizations like ours. For the next hour, David walked me through what he called a financial health assessment. He asked about my monthly expenses, my income sources, whether I had family who helped with finances. Every question was designed to map out my vulnerabilities and assets. I answered each one carefully, painting the picture of a woman who was comfortable, but not wealthy, confused but not helpless, isolated, but not completely alone. It sounds like Harold took very good care of you, David concluded. The life insurance policy should provide good security, and those investment accounts show he was planning well for your future. Sometimes I wonder if I should just sell everything and move to one of those senior communities, I said, watching his reaction carefully. This house is so big for just one person, and some of those places look so nice in the brochures. David leaned forward intently. Mrs. White, that's a very important decision, and it's not one you should make in a hurry. There are so many factors to consider: tax implications, market timing, making sure you get fair value for your assets. Have you talked to anyone about this? A financial advisor or family member? Harold's nephew called once, but he lives in Denver and he's so busy with his own family. I don't want to bother him with my problems. Perfect. I had just told him I was considering liquidating my assets and had no nearby family to consult with. I could see the calculations running behind his eyes. Mrs. White, I think we can help you much more than I initially thought. Would you be comfortable if I came back tomorrow evening? I'd like to bring some materials that might be helpful, and we can start organizing Harold's papers properly. That would be wonderful, I said. What time works for you? How about 8 p.m.? I know it's a bit late, but I'll have more time to tend to your situation. Later, when neighbors were less likely to see him, when I'd be more tired and potentially less alert, every detail of his approach was textbook predatory behavior. 8 o'clock is perfect, I agreed. Should I gather all of Harold's papers together? Actually, Mrs. White, let me handle that tomorrow. Sometimes these financial documents can be overwhelming when you try to organize them yourself. I'll bring some tools that will make the process much easier. Tools? I'd bet my pension those tools would include power of attorney forms and other documents designed to give him access to my accounts. After David left, I sat in my living room and reviewed the evening through my security footage. Everything had gone exactly as planned. He had taken photos of my bank statements, mapped out my financial situation, confirmed that I was isolated and confused, and established himself as my trusted helper. Tomorrow night he would return expecting to find the same vulnerable widow he'd met tonight. Instead, he was going to meet Betty White, retired FBI special agent, and learn exactly what happens when you underestimate your target. But first, I had a phone call to make. Jake, it's Betty. He took the bait. Tomorrow night at 8 p.m., we're going to catch ourselves a predator. The next evening, I prepared for the performance of a lifetime. I had spent the day reviewing all my old case files on financial predators, making sure I remembered every technique, every legal requirement for evidence collection, every detail that would make this night count. At 7:45 p.m., I was ready. I had changed into a different dress, still appropriately elderly but slightly less frail-looking. I had positioned additional documents around the living room, including what appeared to be power of attorney forms and bank account information. Everything was set to look like a confused widow had spent the day trying unsuccessfully to organize her late husband's papers. When David arrived at exactly 8 p.m., he was carrying a leather briefcase and wearing the same trustworthy smile, but there was something different in his eyes, a predatory gleam that he was no longer bothering to fully conceal. Good evening, Mrs. White. I hope you haven't been worrying too much about all this paperwork. Oh, David, I'm so glad you're here, I said, leading him into the living room. I tried to organize Harold's papers like you suggested, but I'm afraid I've made quite a mess of things. He surveyed the scattered documents with what he probably thought was sympathetic concern. Mrs. White, please don't worry about that. That's exactly why I'm here. As he settled into the same chair as the night before, I watched him take in the scene. The bank statements were still visible, now joined by what appeared to be insurance documents and investment account summaries. I had been very careful to make sure the numbers were consistent and believable, enough assets to be worth his time, not so much as to trigger suspicion. Now, Mrs. White, I've brought some forms that will help us get your finances organized properly, David said, opening his briefcase. The first step is to establish a clear picture of everything Harold left behind, and then we can start making sure it's all properly protected. He pulled out a stack of official-looking documents. I recognized several of them from my FBI days: power of attorney forms, bank account authorization forms, and what appeared to be investment transfer documents. All of them were designed to give him legal access to my accounts. These look very complicated, I said, glancing at the papers with apparent confusion. Are you sure I need all of this? Mrs. White, I know it seems overwhelming, but these forms are standard procedures for protecting your assets. Given your situation, living alone, no nearby family, Harold's complex investment portfolio, we need to make sure everything is properly secured. There it was. The justification for why I needed to sign away control of my finances to a complete stranger. He was good. I had to give him that. But I had been handling con artists since before he learned to walk. I suppose Harold would want me to be careful, I said, reaching for one of the forms. What exactly does this one do? That's just a standard power of attorney document, David explained smoothly. It allows Senior Care Network to act on your behalf in financial matters if you're ever unable to do so yourself. Think of it as a safety net. A safety net that would give him complete access to my bank accounts, investment portfolio, and the ability to transfer funds without my knowledge. I had seen this exact setup dozens of times in my FBI career. And this one? I asked, pointing to another document. That's an account monitoring agreement. It allows us to keep track of your financial situation and alert you to any unusual activity. Unusual activity, like unauthorized withdrawals that he would be making himself. The audacity was breathtaking. For the next 30 minutes, David walked me through each document, explaining how each form was designed to protect me while actually giving him complete control over my finances. He was professional, patient, and utterly convincing. If I had actually been the confused widow I was pretending to be, I would have signed every single paper. Now, Mrs. White, there's one more thing we need to discuss, David said as I applied to be considering the documents. For this protection plan to work properly, it's important that you don't mention it to anyone else right away. Why not? I asked, looking genuinely puzzled. Well, sometimes family members or neighbors don't understand these financial arrangements. They might worry unnecessarily or try to interfere with the process. It's better to get everything properly set up first, then explain it to others once they can see how well it's working. Isolation and secrecy. The final pieces of his strategy. He wanted me cut off from anyone who might recognize what was happening and stop it. I suppose that makes sense, I said slowly. Harold always said I talked too much to the neighbors anyway. David smiled, probably thinking he had successfully maneuvered me into the perfect position. Harold sounds like a very wise man. That's when I decided it was time to drop the act. I sat back in my chair and looked directly at David, letting my posture straighten and my voice become clear and strong. You know, David, Harold was indeed a wise man. One of the wisest things he ever told me was to never trust anyone who wanted me to sign papers without reading them carefully. David's smile flickered slightly. Of course, Mrs. White. You should always read. Another wise thing Harold told me, I continued, cutting him off, was that when someone asks you to keep secrets from your family, it usually means they're up to no good. Now David was looking genuinely uncomfortable. Mrs. White, I think there might be some misunderstanding. Oh, there's no misunderstanding, David. Or should I say David Patterson from the Senior Care Network that doesn't actually exist. The color drained from his face. Mrs. White, I don't know what I think, David, is that you picked the wrong lonely widow to con. I reached over my end table and picked up a small device that looked like an old-fashioned radio. This little gadget has been recording our entire conversation, both last night and tonight. David started to stand up, but I held up my hand. I wouldn't if I were you. You see, I've also been filming everything through those security cameras you didn't notice, and my former partner, Jake Morrison, is sitting in his car outside with a very clear view of all the exits. Former partner? David's voice was barely a whisper. 35 years with the FBI, specializing in fraud cases. Retired in 1995, but once you learn to spot a predator, you never really stop. I smiled. Not the confused, helpless smile I'd been giving him for 2 days, but the sharp, predatory smile I used to give criminals right before I arrested them. You walked into the most elaborate sting operation Golden Valley has seen in decades, and you never even knew it. David was frozen in his chair, the briefcase full of fraudulent documents still open on his lap. This can't be legal. Oh, it's completely legal. You came to my house, you attempted to defraud me, and I recorded evidence of your crime. The only question now is whether you're working alone or if there are others I need to worry about. That's when David made his second mistake of the evening. He bolted for the door. David made it exactly 12 feet before Jake Morrison stepped through my front door. At 89, Jake might have been older, but he was still 6 feet tall and had the presence that came from decades of arresting people who thought they were smarter than he was. Going somewhere, son? Jake asked mildly, blocking David's path to the door. David spun around, looking wildly between Jake and me. You can't do this. This is entrapment. I laughed. Actually laughed as I stood up from my chair. Entrapment. Oh, honey, you clearly don't understand how law enforcement works. Entrapment is when we force you to commit a crime you wouldn't otherwise commit. You called me, remember? You came to my house, you brought fraudulent documents, and tried to steal my money. All I did was give you the opportunity to show me who you really are. Jake was pulling plastic zip ties from his jacket pocket. David Patterson, if that's even your real name, you're under citizen's arrest for attempted fraud, elder abuse, and criminal impersonation. You can't arrest me. You're not police. Actually, I said, walking over to my bookshelf and pulling out my old FBI badge. I may be retired, but I still have authority to make arrests for federal crimes. And attempting to defraud a senior citizen across state lines. That's federal. The fight went out of David, like air from a punctured balloon. He sank down onto my couch, his head in his hands. How did you know? David, I've been catching people like you since before you were born. Did you really think a few phone calls and a fake charity would fool someone who spent 35 years investigating financial crimes? I sat down across from him, no longer bothering with the frail widow act. But let's talk about what I really want to know. How many other women have you done this to? David looked up at me, and for the first time, I saw genuine fear in his eyes. I want a lawyer. You'll get one. But right now, you're going to answer my questions, because I have enough evidence to put you away for 10 to 15 years, and cooperation might be the only thing that keeps you from spending your middle age in federal prison. Jake had finished securing David's hands and was now standing behind the couch like a guardian angel with steel gray hair. Betty, should I call the locals? In a minute, Jake. First, I want to know about the others. I leaned forward and fanned David with the stare that had broken bigger criminals than him. Margaret Hendricks, my neighbor. How much did you take from her? David's shoulders sagged in defeat. 12,000. Her home repair fund. Mrs. Chen on Maple Street. 8,000. She needed a new computer. Mrs. Rodriguez on Oak Avenue. 15,000. Investment advice. My heart sank. 3 women that I knew about, and probably others I didn't. How long have you been working this neighborhood? 4 months, David whispered. I research areas with high senior populations, set up fake businesses, work a neighborhood until someone gets suspicious, then move on. How many neighborhoods? How many victims? David was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. Maybe 20 neighborhoods over the last 2 years. I don't know exactly how many people. 20 neighborhoods. Hundreds of potential victims. Hundreds of Margaret Hendricks, who had lost their savings to this man's practiced smile and fake sympathy. I felt the familiar cold anger that used to fuel my best investigations. Here's what's going to happen, David, I said, standing up and walking to my kitchen. Jake is going to call the Golden Valley Police Department. They're going to arrest you officially. I'm going to provide them with all the evidence I've collected, the recordings, the video footage, the fraudulent documents you brought to my house. I returned with a cordless phone and handed it to Jake. But before that happens, you're going to give me the names and contact information of every single person you've victimized. You're going to tell me where you've hidden the money, and you're going to help me make sure every penny gets returned to the people you stole from. And if I don't, I smiled that predatory smile again. If you don't, I'll make sure the federal prosecutor knows that you were completely uncooperative, that you showed no remorse, and that you represent an ongoing danger to vulnerable seniors across multiple states. Federal judges tend to be very unsympathetic to people who prey on the elderly. David. Very unsympathetic indeed. David stared at me for a long moment, then slowly nodded. I'll tell you everything. And he did. For the next 2 hours, as we waited for the police to arrive and complete their procedures, David gave me a complete confession. Names, addresses, bank account numbers, the locations of safe deposit boxes where he'd stashed cash, even the names of other criminals he'd worked with in different cities. By the time the police led David away in handcuffs, I had enough information to recover nearly $300,000 in stolen money and alert law enforcement in 6 states about his activities. More importantly, I had a complete list of his victims, 37 seniors across California, Nevada, and Arizona, who thought they'd lost their savings forever. As Jake and I watched the police car disappear down the street, he shook his head admiringly. Betty, that was the most beautiful thing I've seen since we took down the Ramirez money laundering operation. It's not finished yet, Jake. Now comes the real work, making sure every single one of his victims gets their money back, and that this bastard never gets the chance to hurt anyone else. That night, after Jake left and my house was quiet again, I sat in my living room with a cup of tea and Harold's photo. "Well, honey," I said to his smiling face, "remember how you used to worry about me being bored in retirement? I think I just found my new hobby." 6 months later, I was standing in the community center of Golden Valley, looking out at a room filled with faces I had come to know well. There was Margaret Hendricks, who had gotten every penny of her $12,000 back and had started a neighborhood watch program. Mrs. Sheehan, who used her recovered $8,000 to take a computer class and was now teaching other seniors about online safety. Mrs. Rodriguez, whose $15,000 had been returned with interest, and who had become my co-coordinator for what we now called the Golden Valley Senior Protection Network. The local news crew was setting up their cameras for what they kept calling the feel-good story of the year. I had to laugh at that description. There was nothing feel-good about elderly people being victimized by predators, but there was definitely something satisfying about watching those predators get exactly what they deserved. Mrs. White? The young reporter, she couldn't have been more than 25, approached me with that eager expression that meant she was about to ask a question she thought was very important. "Our viewers are fascinated by your story. What made you decide to take such an active role instead of just calling the police?" I looked at her for a moment, thinking about how to answer. "Honey, when you've lived as long as I have, you learn that sometimes the system needs a little help. The police are wonderful, but they can't be everywhere. Sometimes the best way to catch a predator is to give them exactly what they think they want." "But weren't you afraid? Taking on a criminal like that? At your age?" "At my age." I smiled, remembering how David Patterson had underestimated me because of those exact same words. Fear is a luxury I stopped being able to afford about 35 years ago, when I started working for the FBI. When you've stared down armed drug dealers and money launderers, one small-time con artist doesn't seem so scary. The reporter's eyes widened. She clearly hadn't done her research. "You were 35 years, specializing in financial crimes. Retired in 1995, but apparently not as retired as I thought." I gestured toward the crowd of seniors filling the community center. "It turns out, there's still plenty of work to do." After the news crew finished their interviews, we got down to the real business of the evening. The Golden Valley Senior Protection Network had grown from my one-woman sting operation into a comprehensive program that now served 12 neighborhoods. We taught seniors how to recognize scams, provided them with direct lines to law enforcement, and, most importantly, we had created a system where no senior had to face financial predators alone. Margaret Hendricks stood up to address the crowd. At 82, she had transformed from a victim into a fierce advocate. 6 months ago, I thought I was the most foolish woman in California for falling for a con man's lies. Tonight, I want to thank Betty White for showing me that the only foolish thing would be to let shame stop me from fighting back. The applause was thunderous. But what made me proudest wasn't the recognition, it was seeing the faces of people who had gotten their power back. Mrs. Chen, who now helped other seniors navigate technology safely, Mrs. Rodriguez, who had started a financial literacy program. Even some of David Patterson's victims, from other states, had traveled to California to join our network and start similar programs in their own communities. "Betty," Margaret continued, "would you like to tell everyone what happened to our friend David?" I stood up, feeling every one of my 98 years, but also feeling stronger than I had in decades. David Patterson was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison for elder fraud, criminal impersonation, and racketeering. The judge made it very clear that preying on seniors would not be tolerated in her courtroom. More applause, but I held up my hand. But more importantly, David's information led to the arrest of 6 other scammers working similar schemes across the western United States. Between all of them, we recovered over $800,000 in stolen money and returned it to the people it belonged to. An elderly man in the back row raised his hand. "Mrs. White, do you think this will stop other criminals from targeting seniors?" I thought about that question seriously before answering. Honestly, no. There will always be people who see vulnerability and think opportunity. But here's what I know for certain. They won't find it as easy as they used to. Word gets around in criminal communities, just like it does in ours. The story of a con man who thought he was targeting a helpless widow and instead walked into an FBI sting operation. That story is going to make a lot of predators think twice before they come to Golden Valley. After the meeting, as people were filing out and exchanging contact information, Jake Morrison pulled me aside. "Betty, there's something I need to tell you. I've been getting calls." "What kind of calls?" "Other retired law enforcement. Other seniors who heard about what you did. There's a woman in Phoenix whose husband was a DEA agent. She's got a similar scam artist problem in her neighborhood. A former detective in Tampa who wants to know if our methods would work against home repair scams. Even someone from the FBI field office in Sacramento who's asking if we'd consider consulting on elder fraud cases." I looked at Jake, seeing the same gleam in his eyes that I felt in my own. "Are you thinking what I think you're thinking?" "Betty White's Senior Protection Network," he said with a grin. "Has a nice ring to it, doesn't it?" 3 months later, I was sitting in what used to be Harold's study, now converted into a command center, with computers, filing systems, and a wall map showing pins in 37 cities where we had active operations. At 98, I had become the CEO of something I never expected. A nationwide organization of retired law enforcement officers and fed-up seniors who were fighting back against predators. The work was exactly what I had trained for my entire career, just with a different perspective. Instead of waiting for crimes to be reported, we were preventing them. Instead of consoling victims after they'd been robbed, we were catching the thieves before they could steal. And instead of working alone, I was part of a community of people who refused to be seen as easy targets. My phone rang, the special line we'd set up for the network. "Senior Protection Network," Betty White speaking. "Mrs. White?" The voice was shaky, uncertain. "My name is Dorothy Chen, no relation to the Mrs. Chen in your neighborhood. I live in Portland, Oregon, and I think someone's trying to scam me." "Tell me what's happening, Dorothy." "There's this young man who's been calling me about my Medicare benefits. He says there are new policies that require me to verify my information, and he wants to come to my house to help me fill out forms, but something about him doesn't feel right." I smiled, reaching for a pen and a fresh notepad. "Dorothy, you're absolutely right to trust that feeling. Now let me tell you exactly what we're going to do about it." As I talked Dorothy through the setup for what would become our 38th sting operation, I caught sight of Harold's photo on my desk. He was smiling that gentle smile I remembered so well. And for just a moment I could almost hear his voice, saying what he always said when I was about to embark on a new case. "Go get him, Betty." The predator who was targeting Dorothy Chen had no idea what was coming his way. He thought he was hunting a vulnerable senior citizen in Portland. Instead, he was about to become the latest criminal to learn that underestimating Betty White was the biggest mistake of his life. But here's what made this moment different from all the others. I wasn't doing it alone anymore. Dorothy would have backup from our Portland team. She'd have legal support from our network of retired prosecutors. She'd have technical assistance from our group of former FBI agents who specialized in surveillance and evidence gathering. And most importantly, she'd have the knowledge that she was part of something bigger than herself. A community of seniors who had decided that being older didn't mean being helpless. The young man who was planning to victimize Dorothy thought he was dealing with one frightened elderly woman. What he was actually facing was the collective wrath of hundreds of seniors across the country who had turned the tables on predators and discovered that revenge, when served with precision and justice, was the sweetest dish of all. As I ended the call with Dorothy and started making the arrangements for Portland Team Alpha to swing into action, I realized something that made me laugh out loud. At 98 years old, I wasn't winding down my career. I was just getting started on the most important work of my life. And somewhere out there, in cities across America, there were criminals who specialized in targeting seniors who were about to get a very unpleasant surprise. They were about to discover that this generation of elderly Americans included a lot of people who had spent their careers catching criminals, and retirement had just given us more time to perfect our methods. The hunter had become the hunted, and Betty White was leading the pack. That night, as I turned off the lights in my command center and headed upstairs to bed, I paused at the window overlooking my neighborhood. Golden Valley was quiet and peaceful, the streetlights casting gentle pools of light on the sidewalks where seniors could walk safely without fear of predators lurking in the shadows. It had taken 6 months, but we had done more than catch one criminal. We had changed the entire dynamic of power in our community. The predators who used to see easy targets now saw organized resistance. The seniors who used to live in fear now lived with confidence. And the criminals who thought age meant vulnerability had learned that sometimes age just means experience. Tomorrow, there would be more calls from people like Dorothy, more sting operations to plan, more evidence to gather, more predators to catch. But tonight, I could rest knowing that Harold would be proud of what his retirement hobby had become. I had spent 35 years with the FBI protecting people from criminals. Now I was spending my golden years teaching criminals why they should have left us alone in the first place. And at 98 years old, I was just getting warmed up. The story you've just heard isn't just about one woman's fight against one criminal. It's about what happens when people decide they're tired of being victims. It's about the power that comes from experience, the strength that comes from community, and the justice that comes from refusing to let predators win. If you're a senior who's ever felt vulnerable, remember this: your age isn't a weakness, it's a weapon. You've lived long enough to see every trick in the book, and you've earned the right to fight back with everything you've learned. And if you're someone who preys on the elderly, consider this a warning. We're not as helpless as you think we are. We're not as isolated as you believe. And we're definitely not as forgiving as you hope we'll be. Because in this house, we remember that wisdom doesn't just come with age. Sometimes it comes with handcuffs. Thank you for listening to my story. This is Betty White, reminding you that it's never too late to fight back, and revenge has no expiration date. Subscribe to Grandma True Stories, because we're not done teaching lessons yet.